What happens when a woman's own son leaves her forever, and her husband is no longer by her side? When her life becomes nothing but silence, loneliness, and pain. And in that emptiness, one day she meets a stranger, a man she lets into her home, a man who slowly starts filling the void in her heart. What unfolds next is what we'll see in today's story. So let's begin. The movie opens with Margaret, who starts her morning routine by taking a swim in the pool. After spending some time in the water, she steps out quietly. Margaret lives alone in her house. A few months earlier, she had a major fight with her husband, and since then she spends most of her time at the store she owns. As usual, she goes to the store where one of her employees tells her, "Ma'am, a man came by earlier and left a letter for you." Margaret replies, "All right, I'll check it later," and continues with her work. That evening, after closing the shop and returning home, she receives a message from Matt, the man who used to be her husband. But Margaret ignores it. She has decided she wants to live her life alone now. The next day, when Margaret arrives at the shop, she finds Matt standing there. This time, he asks her to join him at a nearby cafe. Margaret hesitates but agrees. At the cafe, Matt looks broken. He speaks in a heavy, sad voice. "You even changed your name. But don't worry, I didn't come here for that." He then shows her a picture of their son. "Our son has been missing for 2 weeks," he says. "I filed a police report, but there's still no sign of him. I don't know where he is." Margaret quietly responds, "I don't know where he is either." Hearing that, Matt completely breaks down and leaves. He had come hoping Margaret had their son, but she didn't. Margaret sits there for a while, lost in thought, then returns to her shop. She prints out a photo of her son and tapes it to the store window. She hopes that maybe someone might see it and help. The day passes, evening arrives, and it's time to close the store. But as Margaret steps forward to lock up, she sees a stranger lying unconscious near the shop. She immediately shuts the store and rushes to help him. She brings him home, tends to his wounds, and bandages his injuries. There are bruises all over his body. She tries waking him up. When he doesn't respond, she goes to get water. But when she returns, he's gone. Shocked, Margaret looks around the house and steps outside, trying to find him. But the young man has vanished. The next morning, Margaret wakes up to a call from Matt. His voice trembles as he says, "Our son's body. It was found in a pile of garbage. Will you come to the funeral?" Without thinking, Margaret says no. Her heart was already shattered. After losing her son, she no longer had any strength left. One day, she sits by her son's grave, silently realizing that her husband had drifted away, and now her child was gone too. Margaret was completely alone. As always, she goes to the swimming pool, and there, she spots the same young man she had helped earlier. She walks up to him and gently asks, "How's your hand?" "It was me who treated your wounds the other night." The young man, Joe, smiles softly and says his arm is fine now. He thanks her. For the first time in a very long time, someone had spoken to Margaret with warmth, and it made her feel alive again. Margaret stayed quiet for a moment and then softly said, "If you don't have a place to stay, you can live at my house. There's a spare room." Joe immediately nodded in agreement. Margaret took him home and showed him around. When they reached the upstairs room, she said, "You'll stay here, but the kitchen and bathroom are downstairs, so you'll have to come down for meals and showers." Joe looked around the house for a while in silence. For the first time in a long while, he felt like life had finally offered him a hand. He liked the room. That night, Margaret cooked dinner for Joe, but when she returned to the kitchen later and picked up her purse, it felt lighter. She instantly understood Joe had taken some money from it. Still, she decided not to say anything. He had just moved in, and she didn't want to scare him away. In the middle of the night, Margaret woke up. She glanced toward the upstairs room. It was empty. When she went downstairs, she found Joe asleep on the couch near the TV. But as she walked past him, Joe opened one eye and looked at her with a strange, unreadable expression. Margaret ignored it and went back to her room to sleep. The next morning, there was a knock on the door. When Margaret opened it, a woman was standing there, an investigator. She asked, "Your neighbor mentioned that your husband hasn't been living with you for quite some time. Is that true?" Margaret replied, "Yes, he hasn't been here for a while. I don't know where he is. Maybe he's gone somewhere far." The agent said, "Andrew's wife can't afford the expenses for their son anymore, so I'm gathering some information." Hearing this, Margaret went silent. She truly knew nothing. The agent's eyes then moved toward a car parked nearby. She began asking about it, but before Margaret could answer, Joe stepped out of the room and said, "That car is mine." Without suspicion, the agent left. Margaret was relieved. She smiled slightly at Joe and said, "You You saved me from trouble. If you want to drive my car, go ahead." She handed him the keys. Joe happily took the car and went out for a drive. Meanwhile, Margaret went to a store to buy some supplies. After picking up what she needed, she returned home. When she walked inside, she found Joe sitting comfortably with a lit cigarette. Margaret was annoyed and told him, "Don't smoke inside the house." Then she went into her room, grabbed a drink, came back out, and offered it to him. "Come on, let's have a drink." They sat together, talking. Joe handed her his cigarette, and Margaret took a drag from it. She looked happy, like she had smiled for the first time in years. Joe then looked at her hands. His own hands had healed completely, and in exchange, he gently touched hers. Margaret asked, "Where are your mom, dad, brothers, and sisters?" Joe replied, "They're all around, but I don't live with them. I left that house years ago." Changing the subject, Margaret asked, "Do you know how to swim?" Joe said, "No." The next day, Margaret took Joe to the same swimming pool she used to visit before. When Joe stepped into the water, Margaret said, "To swim properly, the most important thing is how you move your arms, like this, and keep your body light. Slowly, you'll learn." Joe followed her instructions, and Margaret patiently taught him how to swim. In that moment, she felt something. She had lost her first child, but maybe God had sent her someone to hold her up again. While practicing, both Joe and Margaret looked genuinely happy. Then suddenly, Joe lifted Margaret in his arms, just like a child who excitedly picks up his mother while playing in the water for the first time. They were both smiling, both lost in that small moment of joy. By the time they left, it was already late at night. As Margaret walked out of the pool area, she saw Matt standing outside. Matt, her ex-husband. He smiled and said, "You still haven't stopped swimming. Even when you lived with me, you came here every day." He paused for a moment and then said quietly, "I want to talk with you, just for a little while. If you're free, can we sit somewhere and talk?" Margaret didn't have the strength to refuse. She agreed. Later, the two of them ended up in a hotel, where they spent the night together in silence. Margaret let him come close, but inside, she still felt a deep emptiness. Meanwhile, Joe had wandered out into the streets, as if he was searching for Margaret. But whoever crossed his path, he beat them out of sheer anger. His world revolved only around her. The next morning, while doing laundry, Margaret noticed a pocket inside Joe's shirt. There was a photo inside, Joe with his mother. She realized that Joe missed his mother deeply. When Margaret stepped outside the room, she froze. Joe was starting her car. As soon as he saw her, he asked, "If you want, we can go for a drive. Might feel good." Margaret didn't refuse. They slipped away quietly so no one would notice them. And after driving for a while, they reached the seashore. Joe, smiling, joked, "Come on, let's swim here." Margaret hesitated, but Joe took off his clothes and jumped into the water, and she had no choice but to follow. They were happy among the waves. Then Joe suggested a strange game. "Let's see who can hold their breath underwater longer." Margaret went underwater and stayed there for over 2 minutes. Joe panicked and ran out of breath, surfacing quickly. When she didn't return right away, he thought she might have passed out underwater. He pulled her out and carried her to the shore. Later, as they were getting dressed, Joe said, "When I was little, I used to play this game with my friends. I'd go underwater and let all my bad habits disappear, and the only thing I'd feel was breath." As he said this, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder, as if trying to tell her that he wanted to teach her something about life. On the way back, Margaret asked, "Does your mother know you're with me?" Joe replied, "She knows nothing." A moment later, Joe spotted some of his friends nearby and suddenly said, "Take the car and go home. I'll catch up later." He walked toward them, and Margaret drove back alone. The next day at Margaret's shop, Matt showed up again. He brought some old clothes belonging to Patrick. "These were lying around the house," he said. "I thought you should have them." Margaret took them home and handed them to Joe, telling him to keep whatever he liked. Joe selected a few pieces, and in that moment, she put it on, and something about it reminded Margaret of her lost son. She quietly followed Joe, heart heavy with memories that refused to fade. Late that night, Margaret suddenly woke up to the sound of running water. She slowly walked toward the bathroom and found Joe sitting alone under the running shower. Margaret knelt beside him and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, trying to comfort him. Joe didn't say a word, and neither did she. Two broken souls sat there, both hurting, both confused, not knowing how to handle their pain. The next day, Margaret attended a party where she unexpectedly ran into her ex-husband, Matt. He looked devastated. He told her that things weren't going well with his current wife and that he had been living in a hotel. He asked if they could meet again sometime, but Margaret quietly refused. At the same party, Joe approached Margaret and asked who that man was. With a sigh, she replied, "He was my first husband." Joe offered to take her home, but Margaret declined again. Joe walked out, only to run into Matt outside. He lost his temper and punched Matt before storming away. Exhausted, Margaret finally reached home, but around midnight, she heard strange noises coming from the room upstairs. She hesitated, walked up the stairs, and peeked through the door. Joe was in the room with another woman. Margaret closed her eyes eyes, held her breath, and quietly walked away with a broken heart. The next morning, her feelings toward Joe had completely changed. While Joe was working near a car, Lucinda arrived, the same woman whose husband had once betrayed Margaret. Lucinda smiled and asked Joe if he could take her somewhere. Joe agreed. Later, Margaret walked by and found Lucinda's little child crying. She rushed over, picked the child up, and tried to calm him. A few minutes later, Lucinda returned, and Margaret handed her the child. Back home, memories of her lost son overwhelmed Margaret again. It felt as if his presence lingered around her. She tried to erase the past, but the pain refused to leave. Joe stepped in quietly, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, trying to understand her grief. For a long moment, they looked at each other, two people carrying sorrow they couldn't put into words. Early the next morning, Margaret left for work, trying to leave the storm of last night behind. Joe slowly woke up, opened a box, and found old photographs inside, including a picture of a small boy. He finally understood why Margaret was always in pain. Feeling heavy-hearted, he left to spend some time with his friends. Later that evening, Joe walked into a store where he saw Matt again. Matt tried to speak to him, but Joe didn't want to talk and walked out. Matt followed him into the alley, and soon, a heated argument turned into a physical fight. Margaret was at home when she suddenly received a voicemail. It was from Joe's mother. Her voice was trembling as she said, "My son Joe is with you. Please answer me." Before Margaret could respond, one of the gang members connected to Joe barged into the house. Fear shot through her body. Her hands and feet went numb. Her clothes were soaked with panic. The man watched her for a moment, confused by her terrified state, and then quietly walked away. Margaret was alone again. A little while later, Matt arrived. He told her that Patrick, their lost son, had slipped near a canal and fallen in. Hearing this reopened Margaret's deepest wound, but she didn't want to say a single word to Matt. Matt, heartbroken and helpless, eventually walked away. Moments later, Joe stumbled into the house, injured, bruised, barely standing. Margaret rushed to him, saw the wounds on his body, and without thinking twice, she held him and took him straight to the hospital. At the hospital, something on the notice board froze her in place. A photograph, a missing child notice. It was her son, and now it confirmed the truth. Her child was no longer in this world. Standing nearby was another woman, Joe's mother. Margaret had already called her because she knew exactly what it meant to lose a son, and she couldn't let Joe's mother suffer that same pain without knowing where her child was. After handing Joe over to his mother's care, Margaret turned away and walked out quietly, slowly, disappearing into her own silence. No explanations, no goodbyes, just the weight of a shattered heart. And just like that, this painful story comes to an end.